is a public webinar hosted by Renewables Grid Initiative and Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. The webinar will be published on our social media accounts, but just so you know that this is still something where we can all have a conversation very openly. So welcome everyone. This is the first webinar within our new Ocean Mitigation Measures Webinar series. It's hosted by RGI and Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. My name is Anna Milanovic-Ruson. I work as an offshore energy and nature manager in RGI, and I will be guiding you through today's webinar. The goal of this webinar is to present to you the work that Offshore Coalition and for Energy and Nature prepared for environmental impacts and mitigation measures, show you the report and the database in this niche, but also open the floor for all of your questions and allow you to participate in the discussion. So without further ado, I also want to introduce you to our speakers that we will have today. Our speakers are just some of the ocean members that we have, but are really important, and they contributed to the workstream that we're going to talk about today. So today with us, we have Wietske van Erp-Talman-Kiep as a lead licensing at large projects offshore in Dutch TenneT TSO. Maria Nilova, offshore energy manager from Iberdrola, offshore wind developer. Pim Sommers, the project lead, nature-friendly offshore energy in the Dutch NGO, the North Sea Foundation, and me as the person that already introduced herself at the very start. But today, we're not alone in this room. It's not only me and the speakers. We have actually all of you in the room with us. When we analyzed the data that you shared with us on who are you representing today, we realized that we have a quite diverse audience. We have audience all the way from academia, civil society, offshore wind and grid developers, and transmission system operators, even some governmental bodies. And it's quite a diverse audience, but what we do share together is this passion for nature-friendly offshore wind and grid deployment. So before we start, I would just like to share a few housekeeping rules so we ensure that everybody is comfortable and everything goes very smoothly. So please introduce yourself and your organization. This means two things. In your name of your account in Zoom, please make sure your name and the organization you represent today is very visible. This also means when you start to speak during the Q&A session, for instance, please again introduce yourself and say where do you work. On the other hand, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. There's quite a lot of us in the room, so we want to ensure that everybody hears everything correctly. If you do have a question, just raise your hand with the function, raise your hand, or write it down in the chat. There will be a moment where we're going to address all of the questions that we receive. However, if you are speaking, please turn your camera on so our panelists and everybody in the rooms can see who they are actually responding to. What can you expect from today's webinar? There are three main parts. First, you will hear this presentation of the report that we launched recently and the database. Then we will have a panel discussion with the speakers that I introduced earlier. And then we will have like a dedicated part of the webinar for your questions. Please keep in mind that after the presentation of the mitigation report, there will be a very quick round of rapid questions where you can ask your quick clarification questions, but save your substantial, more content-based questions for the Q&A round. So without further ado, I would like to jump into the first part of the presentation. So it's a quite diverse audience, and I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with what Ocean or Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature is. So it's a very unique coalition of offshore wind developers, transmission system operators, and environmental NGOs from Northern Baltic Seas, but recently also from the Mediterranean Sea. We have two coalitions, one from the offshore, from the Northern Baltic Seas, and one in the Mediterranean Sea. And this specific workstream that we're talking about today was developed by Ocean in Northern Baltic Seas. You can see some of the members of the Northern Baltic Sea here. So you can see that it's a quite diverse and big group. So we have these three types of stakeholders in the coalition, with RGI in the middle. RGI is a nonprofit organization, but it will fit into the NGO stakeholder group, but we are the coordinator and moderator of this entire coalition. So what does OCEAN actually do? So there are, let's say, 4 overarching goals. One is that we advocate for accelerated and nature-friendly offshore wind and grid deployment. We do this by having these open discussions between our members, and we want to facilitate open forum, but also find common grounds between all of these diverse stakeholders. Through these discussions and different work streams, we identify and fill knowledge gaps by showcasing solutions and innovative practices. The offshore wind and grid deployment, taking care of nature, is a very diverse topic, and we're trying to have this comprehensive view of this. So that's why we address different topics. So from auctioning, maritime spatial planning, nature inclusive design, environmental data management, coexistence with other sectors, and environmental impacts and their mitigation, something we will talk about mostly today. So then how do we deploy offshore wind and grid infrastructure with nature in mind? So there is this, I'm sure you're aware of the concept of mitigation hierarchy. Mitigation hierarchy is here to guide everybody who is developing infrastructure in nature to avoid and minimize their impact on the environment they can find in the field. So the 4 steps of the mitigation hierarchy are avoid, mitigate, restore, and offset. And when we were thinking in the coalition, what are these concrete measures that we would like to actually foster further? We realized that the information on this is quite scattered or fragmented or just not up to date. And not only this, there are quite a few disagreements between stakeholders. That's why we decided to use the forum that we have, the stakeholders that we have in the coalition, to find common ground on these measures. We decided to focus on the bottom-fixed offshore wind and grid infrastructure because this is the technology that is usually used in these seas and used by the developers, for instance, that we have in our coalition. We wanted to have this comprehensive overview, so the measures that are being already implemented from planning, construction, operation, and decommissioning phase. As already mentioned earlier, this is from the coalition that is working in the Northern Baltic Seas. So the geographical scope of this work stream was the Northern Baltic Seas. The point was not just to collect everything that exists, but actually to collect things that are agreed upon by our NGOs, offshore wind developers, and grid developers. And what is the added value is that the collection is also based on the wide experience of more than 25 years operating in this kind of environment. What is important to say is, what does actually mean avoidance and minimization for us? So the first 2 steps of mitigation hierarchy. Avoidance measures for us meant all the measures that are here to reduce the likelihood of significant harm to marine habitat and species. On the other hand, minimization measures are here to reduce or intensity or the extent of impacts throughout the adoption of best practices, either in project design or in scheduling, and with concrete examples to be shown later on. This actually means that we excluded in this collection nature-inclusive design, 3rd and 4th step of the mitigation hierarchy being the restoration and offsetting, in general, on-site or off-site restoration and enhancement. So we had to have this very clear idea what we mean by avoidance and minimization. Now, when we have established the common ground on what this actually means, we had to have some kind of structured way how we collect these measures. So as you can see on the slide, the framework is quite inspired by the DPSIR framework that is widely used with a bit of adjustments. So you can see for every phase that I mentioned earlier, we identified potential pressure being released into the environment, such as noise emissions, light emissions, chemical and solid discharges. Then we identified all of the biodiversity receptors that could be potentially impacted by these pressures, and what would be the impact, the concrete impact. And then we started collecting the measures. This collection was based on literature reviews, interviews with members, but also then discussions in within the coalition members to understand which measures would we like to have in the collection and which not, and why. All of the measures that we collected are then categorized according to their level of implementation. So are they implemented, and to what extent? Are they implemented on a large scale or only in a few examples? Or are these measures just being tested, or they're still in the conceptual phase? This led us into the collection or database of approximately 80 avoidance and minimization measures. We produced, besides this database, we also produced a report summarizing the most important highlights from this work stream. Not all measures are mentioned in the report, that's important to say. But what we wanted to do, we also wanted to elaborate a bit more on other things that we had in the conversation, which couldn't be just captured in a database. So for instance, the knowledge gaps that we identified, or best practices for offshore wind and grid developers, or even recommendations for policymakers and permitting authorities. The report that you can see also in the slide, but also linked in the chat, is available on our website. We often talk in OCEaN how we want data to be transparent and shared and publicly available. That's why we developed this database of avoidance and minimization measures and put it on our OCEaN website. You can see on the slide how the database looks like and how it works. We want to make it very available to everyone. The database that is online doesn't have every single detail that we collected, but we make the full enormous Excel sheet available to everyone if they just request it. So if you're interested in sources that we used, if you're interested in the examples where these measures are implemented, you're free to reach out to us and we share the Excel sheet with everyone. Now, this whole work enabled us also to identify areas where more research is needed to understand the relationship between the infrastructure and biodiversity, or just areas where mitigation measures should be still a bit more developed. And we call them knowledge gaps. But while we were doing this, we also identified a lot of research projects trying to close this gap. The innovation and research is constantly developing in this topic, and we want to highlight the importance of not just recognizing what still has to be researched, but recognizing that the research is being done. So for instance, on the slide, you can see the picture where we summarized all the knowledge gaps that we identified. Electromagnetic fields, ecosystem changes due to abiotic changes, avoidance or attraction from birds or bats when they come close or in a proximity of the offshore wind farm. But for instance, these are just few examples that we identified. Bats and offshore wind farms, this is becoming more and more a topic in the niche. But there is this monitoring, research and development program trying to understand the actual relationship between this receptor and the infrastructure. And it's called Kattegat West Baltic Bats Project. Similar with the birds and offshore wind turbines, there are a lot of testing the design measures that can be done on a turbine level, such as black blade pilot. Chemical pollution, meaning the solid discharges, liquid discharges. Right now, we have to understand what does this mean on a cumulative level. And this is the point of the Anemoy project, for instance. EMF, a topic that is still a bit unclear to a lot of people. There is still research projects that are trying to clarify the concept, clarify the interaction with the biodiversity in the nearby, and if needed, develop specific mitigation measures. Now, after all of this knowledge, we also recognize that there is still some things that can be improved from the offshore wind developers, but also from policymakers or permitting authorities. For instance, light design. There, it's obvious that the light emissions impact the biodiversity around an offshore wind farm. However, the things that offshore wind farms can do are quite limited due to policy making and laws that are available for different reasons. Is it navigation? Is it military? But if there would be more flexibility here, the impact on the biodiversity would be reduced as well. Noise emissions is one other pressure that is being released. And while there are a lot of minimization measures there, or even avoidance measures, there's a need to understand how planning offshore wind farms on a sea basin level, rather on national state level, can contribute to better noise emissions on a cumulative level minimization. And this could be done, for instance, by agreeing on what could be the threshold for the entire sea basin. This threshold should be based on the best available science. On decommissioning, so it was a topic that is still not so relevant, but now it's becoming relevant. A lot of offshore wind farms are reaching their end of life. They're either being prolonged, but some are going to be decommissioned. In these 30 years of offshore wind farms being in the sea, a lot of biodiversity is actually attracted or even ecosystems developed around them. And we would like to understand if the most beneficial thing for the environment would be to remove entirely the infrastructure or leave some there if the ecosystems are developed. But this is still where we need more research and understanding. This was a bit hard with the best practices, and we will discuss why. But there are still some low-hanging fruits that we believe could be implemented throughout the sea basins. For instance, timing and using least intrusive equipment when you have to do surveying should be implemented in general. Or, for instance, micro-siting or siting away from valuable areas for sensitive species, siting substations of the grid in a way that minimizes the number and length of inter-array cabling is also beneficial for environment, but also from economics point of view. Shielding and burying cables reduces the amount of heat and electromagnetic field reduced in the environment. Using soft start or adjusting piling energy in the beginning to allow sensitive species to go away from the area and not be threatened by the new noise is also something that is provided to be very, very efficient. Or, for instance, horizontal directional drilling, which is a technique that is being done in the coastal environments to literally drill below the sensitive habitat that is found in the coast, is also something that should be done. Now we finished all of this, but what are we going to do with this? So as I already mentioned, innovation, new practices are constantly being developed, and we want to keep our collection up to date. That's why we're going to do an annual revision of all collected measures. We identified the knowledge gaps, but we're not going to stop on this identification. We're going to focus on these knowledge gaps and innovation. And one of the things that how we want to do this is through this mitigation webinar series. So this is a series, this is just the first episode, and we would like to have more episodes focusing on the knowledge gaps. So think about what would you actually like to know in the next webinar. The topic of mitigation can be quite technical. That's why we want to develop a mitigation infographic where we depict this more abstract terms in a way that is clear to the audience that is not necessarily always talking and working in this field. And now we have this report, we have the database, we have this knowledge and agreement between the stakeholders. We want to use the power that gave us for the dissemination, communication, and advocacy. We're aware that there are similar work streams going on in different fora, such as OSPAR, NSEC, and similar, and we want to ensure that we don't duplicate the efforts, rather find synergies between these work streams and enable the accelerated nature-friendly offshore wind and grid deployment. Thank you everyone for listening to this presentation. Before I give the floor to our speakers, I want to give the opportunity for any quick questions from the audience. If there's some, raise a hand or write it in the chat. If it's too early, there will be a Q&A after panel discussion, and we will have more time to answer in a substantial manner. It doesn't seem like there's something, which is also not a problem. Hopefully the panel discussion inspires you a bit more. Now, reintroducing my panelists again. We have Wietske van Erp, Talman Keep, Maria Nilova, and Pim Sommers. Thank you for joining us for the panel discussion. So I would just like to kickstart the discussion, and we can see if there's something in the chat later on. So you are all OCEAN members, and thank you for contributing to this work. But I think we can all recognize that this was quite a long and laborious process. But the added value of this interaction is that I feel like all learned something from it. So I would like to ask Pim, maybe you to break the ice. What is the one thing that maybe you learned throughout this process working with the members on this specific work stream?
Yes, thank you, Anna. Well, thank you for the invitation of this webinar, and thank you all for being here. Great to see so many people joining this webinar. Yeah, so it was really interesting working on this topic with all the different members, because I think the uniqueness of OCEaN, of the coalition, working together with the different sectors, I think really enriches the discussions of the work stream that we had on mitigation. So there were discussions on relevance and effectiveness of different measures. For instance, bird watcher, what can he actually do, or how effective are their contributions? So these types of discussions really, I think, enriched the discussions that we had, and really underlined that no single sector holds all the answers to what is best. So I think that's the main thing I learned is that this is really valuable to step out of your bubble and interact with others in order to get the most comprehensive view of what the best solution might be.
Thank you, Pim. Maria, I see you nodding. Is there something that you would like to add to this?
Thanks, Anna. I do agree with Pim that looking at other other views from different sectors is very valuable. I would also add to that OCEaN members come from different countries and they work under different regulatory regimes. And in some markets, there are practices that are widely accepted, but they might be only newly introduced in other countries and sea basins. I think it was very interesting to share experience from working in UK waters, for example, in the North Sea, and see how that experience can be adapted to other sea basins and potentially accepted as standard mitigation in other countries. And I just wanted to highlight that all the discussions were very transparent, and people were kind of allowed to critique and question, certain methodologies, which actually allowed us all to come to like a common ground in the end, which resulted in the report. So that was very valuable.
Thank you, Maria. Wietske, was there anything for you as a grid developer that was new?
Yes, hi everyone, and thanks for joining. Good to have you here on so many. Yeah, agreeing with Pim and Maria, of course, and adding that it it helped during the process, the interaction with the different stakeholders and offshore players to extend the knowledge, obviously, but it's not the knowledge, but it's science-based knowledge. So it helps collect measures via best practices, but also via research to really set targets based on science and proven research. That was really one of the big benefits out of this process. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree. There was a lot of different discussions, a lot of disagreements, but also agreements. And the point was that everything that we collect is in a certain way based in science and in experience. Thank you. But I think you mentioned also a very, very interesting point, Maria, on how working in different sea basins also provided that collecting measures that can be just easily replicated across the world is impossible. We know that there is this wish to create like a fact sheet with all of the must-haves that can be then implemented everywhere, but that provided to be very difficult. Maybe Maria, you can say from offshore wind developer point of view, why this is difficult to be done.
Yes, I think as an offshore wind developer, we have to consider a lot of different factors. And it's not just the environmental conditions that can vary throughout the world and in different sea basins, but it's the ground condition, the engineering constraints that could mean that not all the mitigation measures can be implemented. So like one of the noise mitigation measures that is widely accepted is bubble curtains. But in deeper waters or in areas with high speed currents, these are not particularly useful and they're very difficult to deploy. So it is, for example, important to note that not all the measures can be implemented in every single case. And I think having like a checklist approach will also potentially restrict innovation. And as a developer, we want to promote innovation in the technology. We want to encourage the supply chain to develop new methods, new techniques, and new instruments to help us mitigate for any installation impacts or any construction restrictions. So yeah, I think it's good to have a starting point of sort of best practice measures, but in reality, the more adaptable we are as a developer, the more we can actually reduce the risk to any nature receptors in that specific case.
Thank you, Maria. Fitzke, is there like a concrete example, just like bubble curtain, that a grid developer can just replicate everywhere?
That we can replicate everywhere has to be seen, but that we would like to, replicate whenever possible. So yeah, we also apply bubble curtains with the platforms that the substation platforms that we deploy offshore. And also, the acoustic deterrent devices that we have or the warning systems that we have for specific species, so that they can, let's say, get away out of the area prior to the execution or the works. So there are several mitigation measures that we can take. Some of them are also prescribed in the permits that we receive. That's what we have to deploy anyways. But we're just learning, if that is helpful enough, or that we need to address more of these mitigation measures while building the newer and bigger platforms that we will be doing in the next few years.
Yes, thank you, Wietske. Pim, from ecology side of things, we've heard from Maria, like the technology and the developer point of view, but ecology, NGO point of view, what do you think? What is the difficulty in developing a checklist?
Yeah, I totally agree with all of the points shared already. The local context is on many different levels. It's very different. So, on the regulatory, on the technical, on the effectiveness of your measures, but also, the abiotic system is also very different, even within one country. So even within the Dutch part of the North Sea, a wind farm constructed above the Wadden Sea, above the Wadden Islands, has completely different salient risks than on the western part of RRC. So these local contexts really ask also for a local case-by-case approach in what are the most important risks as well. So it's not only how effective is the medication, but also what risk is the most important one to tackle here. And obviously there are pressures that are occurring everywhere and that we need to be addressed everywhere. So then it's more a case of effectiveness, for instance, with the noise emissions. But there's also with different, with stratification. So the water layers is very local. So they're more farther ashore. There might be more seasonal stratification, having different impacts on the system when you build there rather than closer to the coast. So there's not really a way in how you can address all these different local contexts into a list of practices to be deployed everywhere. So I think with the chapter on best practice in the report, I think those are really good points and a nice list on where to start. But still, you need this this local context and really have a case by case approach. And yeah, that's a really difficult task to do.
Yeah, and I would like to add that if, while we are doing all kinds of research and so more knowledge is becoming available and tested, that it should be, let's say, a lively report or list, that it's not a static one, because it needs to expand or change over time.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, so it's good that the next steps also include, well, the updating of the measures that we found, identified, and well, also regulatory context might change, and so there's a lot of things that will develop. So it's definitely not a static thing. No.
Yes, agreed. And I think now already a few times we mentioned that innovation is constantly happening and that we should always monitor and try to do the best thing that we can. But I'm wondering, Maria, what would you say Iberdrola is doing in this part? Like, what is the new thing that you are innovating or trying to understand better?
So we have a number of different trials currently running or in plan at projects all around the world. And I can give a couple of examples because we do strive to develop, novel monitoring techniques and methods to minimize impacts during operation, for example, where currently there is not a lot of evidence to demonstrate what works and what doesn't. So at our Baltic Eagle project in the German Baltic Sea, we are trialing a bird monitoring system, which is going to use high performance radar and high resolution cameras together with artificial intelligence to identify and track birds as they approach the wind farm and approach individual turbines. So by kind of fine-tuning that system, we're hoping that this research will kind of inform our understanding about bird behavior around wind turbines and provide some more evidence about the level of collision risk that can occur within a wind farm. And so having that evidence will definitely give us an opportunity to potentially minimize those risks during operation. So that can involve stopping rotation of the wind turbine or switching it off at certain periods of the year or the day. So that is something that we're kind of hoping to achieve, and it is definitely very specific to each site. So having those observation sort of complexes at each individual site will kind of help mitigate for impact that is relevant in that specific area. Then another little trial that we're running at Saint-Brieuc wind farm in France to do with bird collision is testing bird deterrence on wind turbines. So basically trying to scare birds off a bit further away from individual turbines, so there is a reduced risk of collision. So we're yet to see the full kind of data set from that trial, but it will be interesting to see if this is something that can be deployed in other areas. And I guess another important topic is underwater noise. And in many countries, we are now obliged to use underwater noise abatement, so underwater noise reduction methods. So far, we've used several different techniques on our projects in Germany, and when we deploy those abatement systems, we also collect the data, and that kind of helps build an evidence base for future projects, but also for the regulators to see which techniques are actually effective in certain conditions, which techniques work better together or on their own. And to build on that knowledge in the North Sea on our East Anglia 3 project, we will be using a special piling hammer attachment later this year. So that is aiming to reduce the piling energy at source, which will hopefully reduce disturbance risk to harbour porpoise that are present in the area. And we don't just kind of use these systems and just deploy them and let them be. We're also, as I said, gathering that evidence, and we're working together with regulators to feed that evidence back so they have, a solid database of all the data and information, and can build their guidance based on real life evidence going forward.
Very interesting, and I believe a lot of people are very looking forward to see the results of this, and hopefully they provide to be very efficient. Wietske, is there anything from TenneT that you would like to highlight, that how TenneT is actually trying to even improve the avoidance and minimization, or understanding the impacts?
Yeah, so we are acting on some of the knowledge gaps that have been identified for one of the examples is electromagnetic fields, and everything that we do not yet know about how those fields have or have not have any impacts on marine life. We do know a bit, over time about AC connections. The DC world is very new, so the knowledge gap is even bigger. So we are involved in several research activities and studies around EMF, of which one is flat EMF or EMF in English, and which is basically a lab research for several years, and we recently received some of the first results from the, let's say, the initial phase, that is giving us some promising and positive outcomes on how fish behave against EMF, which is that they do not initially see any, let's say, or have any avoidance or disturbance. They just swim across those cables in a lab setting. So it doesn't look like there's a big impact. Not saying that they're on small, let's say, smaller effects. It's the same. So that's, let's say, basically phase 2 to do more research into that. But so far, looking positive, carefully positive on if there are any effects, yes or no. So these researches are, of course, long-term and no quick results. But that is what we are putting effort in, working closely with scientific institutes, not only in the Netherlands, but also across countries, to really have that evidence-based knowledge collected, and also, that we can share the data for further research. So it's just we do, let's say, more, or we try to do more than the permit in itself on monitoring requirements and those types of things. We really put effort into research together with knowledge partners as well.
Yes, and if I may add to the flat EMF project that you highlighted, since RGI is also contributing to the project, I would say to everybody in the webinar is to stay tuned. The results are going to be also published to everyone by the end of this year. It's not only the ecological research that we're trying to finish by the end of this year and understand the impacts and relationship between the EMF fields produced by AC and DC cables to the commercial flatfish species, but we're also trying to understand the technical implications. So if there is a need for mitigation measures, or how do you design a cable in a way to produce even less EMF in the field. I'm not forgetting about your PIM, North Sea Foundation. So it's a very active NGO, a lot of different programs, but on this topic specifically, how would you say that North Sea Foundation is helping the nature-friendly offshore wind and grid deployment?
Yeah, thank you. Great to hear all the initiatives by TenneT and even Roda on all the trying to be more nature friendly in that way in mitigating impacts and also gathering new knowledge. I think that those are really necessary and very good. That also industry is very ambitious and active in that field. We as an NGO are more working on the advocacy side of things, and we are also, based on this report, trying to making an appointment with the Minister of Climate and Green Growth in the Netherlands, because we want to hand this a report and also give a bit of a translation in the Dutch context. How are the recommendations in the report for policymakers and permitting authorities? How do they apply to the Dutch situation, and how can this be translated or improved in Dutch policies? And that's on all the, mainly all of the recommendations in the report are also still relevant for the Netherlands, even though there are already policies on some of them. But they can become more stringent. For instance, for the choice of materials, there is already in the pre-qualification of the Dutch tenders, there's already there's already some criteria for having the right material use, but also there's in the new concept tender criteria for the tenders that will be tendered this year. There will be already also criteria on light design. So there are already things that we recommend in the report that are being picked up in Dutch context. But we are working towards hoping that the Netherlands can also help leverage other North Sea countries and also the international North Sea Basin approach in for instance, the underwater noise mitigation and other measures to be more effective across borders as well. For instance, also with bird curtailment, you can, if you only do it in the Netherlands, then the effectiveness, ends at the border, but ecology doesn't end at the border. So in that sense, we are working on a cover letter, Dutch cover letter to hand this report to present it to the Dutch minister. But also on the other hand, on the knowledge gaps, how to address those and how we can help create more knowledge in that sense is we are also publishing a report probably next week or somewhere in February on monitoring of environmental monitoring of environmental impacts of wind farms and grids. And that report is mainly about identifying the gaps and how we can close them by monitoring, and how this strategic environmental monitoring has to be more aligned, because now it's very a national approach, very siloed in the regulations, and the report brings all those information from different countries together. There is more steps to be taken. Of course, there's no real solution yet on how we can align this monitoring requirements better. But I think, with these initiatives that Iberdrola and TenneT and everybody is doing, it would be great if there's a better knowledge sharing and a better standard level of monitoring required, or the techniques used in order to learn from each other and gain knowledge quicker, in order to sooner have more effective mitigation measures to be applied. So that report is coming soon, so stay tuned. But so on that side, we are working on different advocacy products in order to advance this topic.
Thank you, Pim. And if I may add to this, is that this advocacy efforts that you're doing on the Dutch level together with the ministry is not only North Sea Foundation force behind it. You're using also the relationship that you established in OCEaN together with the relevant offshore wind developer in the Dutch context and the TSO, so the TenneT, and I believe Vattenfall is joining you in this.
Yes. Yeah, good that you mentioned. So it's really also we really use the coalition network that we have, which is very valuable in order to also have a shared document in which we present this Dutch context. So it's not us by ourselves. It's very good to add. Thank you.
Yes. Wietske, is there anything that you would like to add to this?
Yeah, maybe briefly is back to the, let's say, the national level, or at least what we can do as TenneT within our, let's say, circle of influence, is that we, in a certain way, also do our own way of advocacy in bringing together, the stakeholders that are a partner or an authority at the North Sea and inform them of what we are doing, referring back to those EMF research studies and updates, also results from our monitoring programs that we are now gaining data of, and sharing that in the wide public. So we have organized one of those meetings back in December. So, and also permitting authorities were there, but also NGOs, the North Sea Foundation was there as well with others. And that was a very valuable way of also feeding into the discussion and help each other, and also the permitting authorities on how to come up with the correct and the, let's say, the best requirements without too many limitations, but, you know, leaving also open innovation and market solutions as well. So that's what we are trying to do, to contribute to that as well.
Yes, thank you, Wietske. Maria, it's not a Dutch context, but maybe even better to hear even in another country how this is going on. Can you maybe expand?
Yeah, just in terms of making sure that work that is being done as part of, you know, the Ocean Coalition, and in the context of this report in particular, I can just say kind of from my own perspective, because I am part of the ecology team at Iberdrola, and we work across different countries. So it is a small but mighty team, but we cover, you know, the UK waters. We have projects in the Baltic Sea, in the US, and, you know, ambitions to sort of develop in other regions too. So having that sort of mitigation report as a baseline, especially for projects in development, is very useful. So I tend to kind of internally share the updates from, you know, discussions from OCEaN on a regular basis. And one of the examples where this was sort of used for a local national project was last year, when the mitigation report was still being prepared, but there was a project collaboration in Scotland that was looking at environmental mitigation, nature inclusive design. And in essence, the first half of their project was also trying to identify kind of standard mitigation measures that both the regulators, the NGOs, and the developers were on board with. So there was a lot of value in kind of passing on the information from OCEaN work via my colleague who was involved in that project in Scotland. So I think it is definitely important to sort of keep the conversations going, even within the, you know, your own organization, because you might never realize that somebody else is working on something very similar, and to kind of share that knowledge, share that experience, and avoid duplication of work where possible. I mean, that benefits everyone.
Thank you, Maria. If there's nothing that any of my panelists would like to add to this, I would like to thank them for all of their input, but the conversation doesn't stop here. Now we would like to open the floor to all of you, that is our audience today, to all of your questions. The questions can be asked in the chat, and then I will read it out, or you can just raise your hand and ask the question directly. It can be about the report, the database, but everything that we discussed here. If you're interested in how the environmental impacts are being assessed, which mitigation measures are you concretely using for certain impact, this is the moment to ask directly. Dan Deleur, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, but I see you raised your hand, so please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, and apologies for the bad quality of the camera. It's my work laptop currently, but thank you so much for the presentation and for the excellent panel discussion. I am currently writing, as part of the UNEP Convention for Migratory Species, Aquatic Species team, a report focused on cumulative impact assessments and migratory species. And I was wondering, in the development of your report and, for example, the best practices, how did you deal with cumulative impacts, and how did you kind of like develop the best practices, and what role did that play in the development of the mitigation measures? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And I can start, and then if somebody wants to supplement my answer, I will obviously give the floor to my panelists. Cumulative impact assessment is something that was the topic of our communication and our discussions, because as you probably know, since you're writing the report on this, there's a bunch of tools being developed, some on different geographical scales, just specific for Sweden, just specific for the Adriatic Sea. And for us, having this European scale, it was a bit hard to decide on one tool that we would promote. And also, it was, again, difficult to define which receptors or which impacts to actually mention in every single cumulative impact assessment. That being said, we do mention it in the report, and in every time when we talk about this, is that cumulative impact assessment should be always done when you're developing your infrastructure. What this actually means for your own situation will probably depend on your ecosystem, on the other sectors that are around you. So we're really trying to focus on the context-based, case-by-case analysis. On cumulative impacts in general, this is something that we discussed in the knowledge gap section also of the report. There are some impacts that are very obvious, and they were always the first cause of the concern, such as berg collisions and stuff like this. It's something that is already established. But thinking about the cumulative development of offshore wind and grid infrastructure, we are becoming aware that there are more nuanced, subtle pressures that might be more significant on the cumulative level in 10, 20 years, depending on the speed of the deployment. And that's why it's super important that we start talking about this already now. But in the report, we didn't identify one tool that we would promote, for instance. I don't know if this completely answers your question, but I would also give floor to, for instance, Pim. I see you're nodding, so maybe you have something to add as well.
I think this is a really important point that you make, because it's well, one of the biggest concerns I would say for us as an NGO, the cumulative impacts of all these different developments, not only the energy transition, but also other activities that are also taking place. But I think it's hard to include it in this ocean work stream, because it's well, also very context based on also regulatory, well, the policies, national policies on cumulative impacts are, I think, very different. And also the different models used or different tools used in every country are different. So I think that the baseline definition would already differ quite a lot between different countries. And this is really a point that really needs attention on the international level. So within NSEC or within GNSBI, the Greater North Sea Basin Initiative, I think this is really one of the key topics that we should talk about and really develop a more standard basin approach on cumulative impacts and how to address them. Because otherwise well, if you only do it silo per country, I think in the end there will still be a problem with cumulative impacts. So it's a very important topic, but also a very hard topic. So I'm glad that you bring it up, but it's I think hard to. I think really the advocacy should go to governments to have this collaborative approach on an international level in NSEC or GNSBI. Yeah.
Thank you, Pim. Maria Fitzke, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I can say, we do address accumulation, but that's on a case, let's say case by case project level, obviously. So that's we do it in the environmental impact assessment. But I think it would help to put that into a context or perspective. It would, if the policymakers, or if it's a long-term vision or strategy for that, and not just let's say per project, per moment in time. So we do what we can do with the knowledge that we have and address it. But that's it for the moment. Yeah.
Thank you, Wietske. Maria?
Yeah, just to kind of add, although sort of cumulative impacts wasn't the aim of the mitigation report itself, I think as part of this discussion today, it's important to mention some kind of international programs that aim to reduce evidence gaps and collect new data in a collaborative way. So my colleagues are involved in the program called Predictor, which is run by the Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Program. And this is looking at developing a coordinated approach to reduce uncertainties around collision risk for birds. The program is not kind of based in one specific country necessarily, but it's aiming to inform regulatory decision making in European countries and in the UK too, and kind of promote international collaboration. So as part of that project, the data collected will include trialing of new monitoring systems. It will include looking at sort of bird migration pathways that are cross-border and what that could mean for, assessing cumulative impacts from different projects. And from sort of our perspective, we're hoping to trial some of those bird monitoring systems, as I previously mentioned, but also share that data from both our UK projects and German projects with that wider Predictor work stream. So I think that kind of cross-border work and the data collection can help inform sort of our understanding of cumulative impacts going forward much better.
Just one last thing to add from my side, with more personal note from NGO perspective. With environmental impact assessment, with cumulative impact assessment, I think that we should really have also a holistic ecosystem approach in which we do not only look at the impact on single receptors, on single species groups, but really make also the links of these different trophic levels within the food web. Between fish and birds, and between benthic habitats and fish, and to really link these up, and just these ecosystem effects. Also, one of the knowledge gaps identified in the report, I think. Well, abiotic changes can drive complete changes in food webs, and I think these cumulative impacts are really not well known and really worrisome. So yeah, in the Netherlands there is a project that will be commencing in April. No regrets. It stands for North Sea Renewable Energy, gaining the required ecological knowledge for the transition. A very long name, but that will have this whole ecosystem view, and will also collaborate with international projects and also include economic and social values, so also including fisheries and those types of sectors. So yeah, I hope that these projects really help to create this better whole ecosystem approach in which we also link different receptors, not looking at them in silo.
If I may add on quickly on that, maybe it's a bit of a sidestep. What would also help, what we learned from the meeting, the stakeholder meeting that I just mentioned before, is that from the researchers, let's say it was said, and that the need of sharing data across borders, and that they become available, the data from, for example, from surveys that are being done on the whatever sea is not common practice currently. So that would definitely help if we have to speed up the research and speed up all kinds of insights on what's happening, so that we can build this database and help on the what the effects are across borders. Then the data that are there should be made available. Apparently that's a really hard thing and not common yet. So I'm not sure what we as Standard can do about it, but I can totally imagine that it would help in what we need at this point to make progress. Yeah. I do not know if somebody from the audience recognizes that data is not available, and survey information sticks to whatever the market or the companies performing these types of things.
Yeah, I think there are people in the audience that would agree with you. Thank you all. And I would also just add one final thing in this conversation on cumulative impacts. As you can see, the one topic can spark quite different points of view and conversation in ocean. But what I would say on cumulative impacts and the development of offshore wind and grid infrastructure and the point of this report, that's why we focused on the avoidance and minimization. So the in general impacts of the offshore wind and grid infrastructure in the long term are really minimized as much as possible. We really want to focus and foster as nature-friendly infrastructure as possible, and this is why we only identified avoidance and minimization. We do have different streams of work on nature-inclusive design, for instance, enhancement and restoration, but we do make a big difference on this. On environmental data, this is something that is now popping up more and more, and it's a logical continuation of this conversation. Environmental data is now something that we're going to work even more in ocean. So maybe there's going to be something that you're going to find interesting even for the cumulative impact assessment report that you're working on. Thank you, Dan.
Yes, thank you so much for all the answers.
We still have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if there's someone brave enough to raise a hand and ask something, that would be really nice to use the opportunity having these speakers here. Manon, go ahead.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Anna, and thank you all of you for the very interesting input. So my name is Mano. I also work at RGI, but I work essentially in the Med-Ocean, so the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature in the Mediterranean Basin. I actually have a question for Maria. It was from the very early on question that Anna asked you, and of course we all recognize that we cannot have a fact sheet or something that or measures that are implemented across sea basins, and of course the Mediterranean one is also has this its own specificity. But as Iberdrola has experience or will have experience on floating offshore wind, which is the technology that will be used massively in the Mediterranean basin. I was wondering if there are some measures that are implemented already on bottom fixed technology that you could imagine being transposed to the floating technology. If this is also something that you have experience with.
Thanks, Manon. I think obviously the floating technology deployment at scale is still in very early days of its development. There are some trial sites and kind of individual turbines that have been tested, but the only sort of the commercial wind farms I believe are very small at the moment. We are developing a few floating sites, including in Scottish waters. And so even though I haven't worked personally on these projects, I can say that the mitigation measures that apply to anything above water will pretty much be almost the same as for fixed bottom foundations, because we're still talking about impacts on birds, on collision risk, on bats potentially. So I think these the kind of best practice mitigation measures are very much transferable to the floating technology. When it comes to the kind of foundation, which is the biggest difference, and the type of anchoring, there are a lot of unknowns at the moment. And even though we have kind of an understanding of how it will work, the kind of deployment at scale might present different risks to nature receptors. But I think getting knowledge from other sectors, from oil and gas, sort of with our floating platforms, I think trying to get understanding of what impacts that could have caused and transferring that knowledge into the floating offshore wind can be very useful. So things like that people have talked about entanglement potential in the anchor chains, things like that. I think there are certain risks that the fixed bottom technology hasn't really thought about because it wasn't relevant. But I can see there's definite benefits to floating technology, especially when it comes to marine noise and sort of during construction and installation. There are opportunities for pretty much removing that risk completely out of the equation. And I think currently the sites that are looking to develop as part of the floating technology are mostly constrained by the environmental conditions in terms of the depth or distance from the coast and things like that. But I think maybe once the floating technology becomes more established, it's in itself will be used as mitigation in areas where noise is a very sensitive topic. That's kind of how I see it going forwards.
Thank you, Maria. Is there anything, Wietske or Pim, from your side that you would add to this? I know floating is maybe not the focus for you at this moment, at least. No.
Really, anything to add? Our experience in that topic is very limited because, well, the complete Dutch continental shelf is very shallow. So it's a topic that is being researched also in the Netherlands, but well, it's not a very big topic in actual implementation yet. So,
Yeah, we have a Dutch context that is quite shallow, so the floating technology probably is not going to be implemented there. Thank you for responding to Manon's question. Manon, is that it? Do you have a follow-up?
No, that was good.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Maria.
Great. This is a final opportunity to ask a question. If there is none, that's also fine. Great. Well, nevertheless, thank you for responding to all the questions, and thank you for posing the questions as well. So we're finally reaching the wrap-up of this session. Before we completely close the session, there are a few more things that I would like to share with you. One of them being these QR codes. So if you like what you heard today and you're interested in hearing more about what OCEAN is doing, please register for our events mailing list, and you can always go and learn more on our website. Now, stay tuned, because we're going to talk about something that is continuation of a series that we already have, which is the Nature Inclusive Design webinar series. And we're going to have another webinar in February, launching the Rich North Sea Toolbox that is focused solely on the nature enhancement through nature inclusive design. The only thing left for me to say is to thank you for joining. As you can see here, these are email addresses from the panelists of today. So if anything popped up as a question for you later, you're free to contact them. Before we completely end this webinar, I would also like to invite you to fill in our survey that is going to pop up in your browsers once we finish this webinar. The point of the survey is to share what you liked about this webinar, what would you like to hear in the next one, and we would really appreciate if you fill it in for us to prepare even better next time. So from my side, this is all. Thank you for joining. Thank you, panelists, for joining as well. Hope you find this useful and engaging, and see you soon in the next webinar.